Hey there YouTube, this is my Singer 4423. I've had this machine for a little over a year now and I'm finally ready to do a review on it. You've seen this earlier in a few of my videos on repairing this machine, and I hope to get into that a little bit before this review is over, how that happened and what I did and why it's more my fault than the machine's. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've used this machine to make everything from a wool insulated Ushanka to a small pack out of a pair of old jeans. I've also used it to make a pouch for the side of a bigger pack, as well as a few odds and ends here and there. For all those things, it's worked really well. The only place that it really struggled was on the pack, and at that point in time I was punching through, I believe, 6 layers of denim and a nylon strap. I had to walk it through that area, but the rest of it went through without a hitch. This machine has 23 different stitches, hence the 4423. There's also like a 4440 and a 4451 or something like that. There's only 3 that I've actually used, other than 1 or 2 decorative stitches, and I'm going to go over those. There are videos out there on what the other stitches do and when to use them. There's also, if you look at Singer's website, I believe they have a diagram that names each and every stitch. The 2 stitches that I use the most are kind of obvious. There's the straight stitch, which is just your first setting, and then the zigzag stitch. I use the straight stitch on most everything that you would use a straight stitch for. It's pretty self-explanatory. The zigzag stitch I use mostly for bar tacks, because I found that the straight stretch stitch is actually a better stitch for most of the time when I need a stretch stitch. You can also use a zigzag, but it's kind of a personal preference. To get the stretch straight stitch or the running stitch, I'm not sure what it's called, you just set your machine to straight stitch and then turn your stitch length over to the blue S. And if you're on this machine, anything that's in blue on the stitch selection dial, you use the blue S for. Everything else you can adjust the stitch length and to adjust that stitch. The straight stretch stitch is something you use when you need to sew like a stretchy fabric. I made a couple headbands for my mom to wear with her face mask, and for that I used the straight stretch stitch because the zigzag stitch on the fabric that I used, it looked terrible, and when it stretched out it just tore it apart. It was not good. With the straight stitch I was able to make it look good and stretch like it needed to. So there's a few features on this machine that most sewing machines have, but not all do, and it's kind of nice to have these things, especially if you're doing a lot of different projects like I have been. The first is you can pull out this tray here, and it's, I believe, called a sewing arm or a free arm sewing machine. This is nice when you're sewing like a pant leg, because you can put it underneath here and go all the way around. It just makes things a lot easier. It also comes with a couple of different presser feet. Let's see if I can find them here. There's your standard presser foot, and this is what you'll use for most projects. There's a zipper foot, which is pretty obvious. It's for putting on zippers. It's fairly narrow, so that way you can get right up next to the zipper when you're putting it in. This will not work with a zigzag stitch, as I found out kind of randomly, because it will sew itself to the project. This here is a button foot. I've not used this. I just use the standard foot when I do buttons. What you do is you lower the feed dogs on your machine, which is around the back of the machine back here, and then you line up the needles with the buttonholes and just run the stitch for, I don't know, a second or two, and it'll sew it nice and tight. I probably should use this because it would make things a lot easier, but I've not found a need to yet. It also comes with a guide. I think this is more for doing quilting and such. I don't know. Again, this is not something I've used, but it does come with it. You also get a seam ripper. Any big project you'll end up using this. I've used this more than I'd like to admit. It does come with a couple of bobbins. I'm not sure how many it originally came with because I've bought more since. The nice thing is they're like $1.50 at Walmart for 12 of them, I think, or 10 of them. The foot I have on here right now is called an even feed foot, and if you're going to do any kind of like make your own gear project or something that has a lot of layers to it, I highly recommend this. They're only like 10 or 12 bucks, and what it does is there's a set of feed dogs in this foot that run at the same rate as the feed dogs on the bottom, so they kind of sandwich together and pull the material through evenly. I know when I was doing my pack, if I hadn't had this, it would have been just a major problem because even with things pinned, it'll still shift around on you. Also, when I was making my Ushanka, I sewed the vinyl to the wool insulation first, and then I sewed the liner, the fleece liner to that. And when I was running the vinyl on the bottom and the wool on top, the vinyl would move, but the wool would just stand there with the standard foot. So I had to put on the even feed foot, and then it pulled everything through like it should. So I highly recommend that. It's a fairly small investment, but this one, it pretty much lives on my machine until I get to something that's too narrow to use it on, and then I take it off. Otherwise, it's always on there. All in all, I feel this is a pretty good entry-level machine for just about anybody. It's fairly decently priced for us on Amazon. I think this one was 120 bucks when I got it, and it's really been great. The only better deal you might find is you find like an old vintage machine on Facebook or at a garage sale, and you can usually pick those up for between 20 and 50 bucks, and they'll serve you well. The only problem is if there's any kind of issue with them, you're going to be fighting that. I know I have an old Singer 503A that I mess with a lot, and I just about got it working right before I got this, and it still gives me a few hiccups here and there, but it does work. It's just this, once I got this, it was nice. It just ran. I didn't have to worry about fixing it or tinkering with it. So, not to say there's nothing wrong with a vintage machine, and you can do a lot with a vintage machine, especially an all-metal one, but just be aware that you may have to tweak with it a little bit, and that can become taxing. One feature I almost forgot to mention is this machine does come with an automatic button holder. You put your button in this and size it, and then pull down the button tool here, and it will sew one half the button, hit that back up, and go around the buttonhole. I've only used it once, but it is really slick and was surprisingly easy to use. If you found this video helpful or informative, please like, share, and subscribe, and remember that knowledge is the only thing that can't be taken from you. See ya.